Well, the long-awaited Silent Hill 2 remake is finally here, a series known lovingly around the world for its contribution to the genre of psychological horror, as much as its contribution to bloated video essays on YouTube. Also being famous as a series for having so many fans who haven't even played the games to begin with.
Yeah, you're right.
And if you've been following along with the development of this thing throughout the years, well, you'll know that the response has been divisive to say the least, with some people expunging the very idea as pointless and unnecessary, while others claiming it's a much needed update. Either way though, I've spent the last few days playing through this thing incessantly, even into the wee hours of the morning. And funnily enough, like the last time I played a game like this was the first time I ever played the original Silent Hill back in 1999. And while I do have mixed feelings about this remake in some areas, I think overall Bloober Team have done a pretty damn good job here, really updating this decades-old game.
You sure?
I mean, it's by far the best game they've ever made, though that's not exactly a massive accolade. Now look, let's just get one thing out of the way first up. Yes, this video is going to contain some minor spoilers. I mean, I'm obviously not going to give away any of the major plot points, and I'm not going to show the late game areas, but if you're at all worried about seeing some of the new locations and you think that's going to ruin the experience because I show them off in my footage, well, then you're better off just not watching, alright?
It's true.
Having said all of that, let's get into it. Right, so the story in Silent Hill 2 is pretty easy to explain on the surface. You're playing as a dude named James Sunderland who randomly receives a letter from his wife saying that she's waiting for him at their special place in Silent Hill. The only thing wrong with that is that Mary's been dead for 3 years, apparently.
Is she really alive?
So, being the husband of the year that he is, lol, James heads to the town to try and track her down, running into 3 other people who happen to be there as well for different reasons, with there being a young woman named Angela, a young man named Eddie, and a little girl named Laura.
Hey! Wait!
And if you're at all unfamiliar with the story, well, then saying any more at this point is really doing the whole thing a bit of a disservice, because you are really best to experience the rest on your own.
None of your business.
But the long and short of it is that Silent Hill, it ain't the kind of place you really want to be spending too much of your spare time. And James soon finds himself under attack by these horrific monsters, along with being even more confused by the appearance of a woman named Maria, who really seems to bear a striking resemblance to his wife.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
Honestly though, I think most people already know what's going on here and what happens in the end, so it should come as no shock then that things play out almost entirely the same in that regard. And as far as the characters, the writing and the plot lines are concerned, this is pretty much just a beat-for-beat remake of the original, even down to the cinematics often using near identical camera angles. Which is, I guess, a pretty good thing to see, considering out of all of the issues that original game had, its writing and themes were absolutely not one of them.
Lost?
The whole thing kicks off pretty well too, with the opening cinematic, again, being really in line with that original. Plus, I really like this new little moment that James has when he's looking in the mirror, where you can see his hand shaking a bit before he finally lets go. I mean, if you already know what James's history is, well, this little animation detail right here, like, it speaks volumes about what's going on inside the dude's head. Anyway, after that, you've got that whole opening sequence as James talks about Mary's letter, before you're then off down that mountain path and running into Angela for the first time in the graveyard. The only thing I'd kind of point out here is that the ambient noise is practically non-existent. I mean, compare this to how foreboding the sound design was in that original game, with all the creepy background noises of the enemies all running around.
This is better.
Plus, there's also like a completely pointless new sequence here added in, where you've got to break into an auto shop to find a key to get through a locked gate, which really adds nothing to this overall prologue, just making it now take a couple of minutes longer. Regardless, shortly after that you're in the town itself, and this is where you'll start to notice how the remake differs from the original. Because despite the overall objective here still being the same, to somehow find your way to the Blue Creek apartments, the amount of stuff you can now do beforehand has expanded quite a bit. Like, there's a whole new sequence now where you've got to explore this smaller apartment building, along with repairing a broken vinyl record before you can even gain access. Also consider the fact that there's now a bunch of buildings you can actually head inside as well, and loot for spare items. In fact, you can even steal shit out of all these parked cars by smashing out the windows. Even when you first get the wooden plank, it takes place inside a small house, as opposed to inside that dead-end tunnel. And what's also instantly noticeable off the back of that is just how aggressive the enemies are in this remake. And early on, the only enemies you need to worry about are those lying figures. But compared to the original, where these guys were just a minor threat, now in the remake, they're far more dangerous and even able to chase you into buildings. I mean, you'll see these guys clamber over broken windows to continue the pursuit, which is not only awesome to watch, but it really highlights one of the best improvements that the remake offers. And that's in just how seamless this world's now become. Because no longer do you have to enter a door and transition into an entirely new area. Nah son, once you load up the game, you can explore the whole environment without any interruption, which is something that carries across throughout the entire campaign. And honestly, stuff like this is a god tier improvement in some of those later areas like the hospital and the prison. Because now you can check out all of these different rooms without having to stare at a dozen loading screens in between. Plus it also just works a hell of a lot better with the combat and healing, because both of these actions are now bound to hotkeys. So every time you've got to pop a health drink or a syringe, or want to change your weapons, you don't have to artificially pause the game world around you to do this. That is a bit of a double-edged sword, because the same applies when you're trying to check your map, which is something you're going to need to frequently do. And while you're doing this, the monsters aren't exactly going to be twiddling their thumbs or scratching their ass, all too happy to try to get a free shot in. Really just makes this the kind of thing where you can turn the lights off, put the headphones on and lube yourself up and really get immersed.
Yeah, you're right.
What I also thought was pretty cool as well is how enemies get covered in more blood the more damage you inflict, which is a nice visual effect, but also kind of works as a sort of unseen health bar, so you can really kind of gauge at a distance how close to death these enemies are. Along with there being basic visual clues to let the player know when James is injured as well, with the edges of the screen getting redder and his movement looking more laboured. Again, it's just one of the many ways that the remakes tried to make sure the player spends less time in menus and more of their time in the actual game. Which kind of makes sense, considering how much effort's clearly gone into bringing this whole thing together. And yeah, visually, it's pretty hard to fault how good this updated version of the town looks, with those fog effects in particular, I think, being a definite standout. I've always found it kind of funny how something which started out as a way of working within the technical limitations of the console in that first game has ended up becoming such an integral and core component for the entire series. I mean, at this point, Silent Hill is arguably as well known for its fog effects as it is for its sexually confusing nurses. There's a really cool sequence early on here as well where the wind picks up and the fog becomes even thicker, and it really makes you feel like you're caught in this hellish whirlwind. When you're on the streets, it always looks like it's just rained, which results in lots of areas with puddles showing off these great reflections. And a lot of those areas inside the other world, which I'm not going to spoil, are suitably unsettling as well. A lot of the time as well, the environment's done a really great job of slowly transitioning you into these areas. And sometimes you can even see this happening in real time with the walls around you visibly shifting. And having Akira Yamaoka return to do the music has made the whole thing sound very official as well, even if the best stuff in the game is still those same tracks he composed over 20 years ago. So despite what faults people might have with this remake on the whole, and I'm sure they're going to have faults, I really don't think the overall presentation is going to be one of them. I mean, Bloober have absolutely knocked it out of the park with this shit. The fact the game doesn't snap back and forth between pre-rendered cinematics and the in-engine stuff also fixes a lot of the disconnect that original game had as well. Having said that though, there's still a bit of an uncanny valley thing going on with some of the characters.
Yeah, you could say that.
I mean, I think James and Maria look fine, but Eddie and Laura, they look kind of off.
See a fart face.
Laura!
Especially Eddie, but you know what, then again, that's probably the whole point of that guy.
Yeah, I remember.
Angela definitely looks more in line now with the traumatized teenager she's supposed to be, though I do think something about her character model still seems a bit off as well. They just didn't spend as much time modeling her and making sure she actually looks like the person she's based off.
I'm not lying.
I don't really want to open up that can of worms on the Maria outfit, but I do want to say that I think it's kind of odd how they kept more or less the exact same outfits for pretty much every single other returning character, but for some reason chose to cover her up.
Hey, it's okay.
All I can think of there is that they were maybe trying to make it look more realistic, considering that original outfit was inspired by something worn at an event by Christina Aguilera. And yes, we all know the meaning behind that outfit, alright? You're not clever for pointing it out. Either way though, it's been changed, which understandably is going to piss off a whole lot of people. The main thing though is that they at least tried to keep her feeling mysterious and seductive, which is the main reason she's there. And you can tell they've really tried to develop her character a whole lot more as well, giving her and James a bunch of new scenes together. Like a whole new sequence inside Heaven's Night where James again acts like he's allergic to sexual tension. Plus, she randomly comments on things you do during the gameplay as well, making her feel much more like a real character.
You startled me. You trying to blind me, James?
And I also really like that little reference they do to her original outfit, which, you know, at some point someone is gonna mod back into the game.
Sure.
Some cinematics even seem to build more upon the inner conflict that James has surrounding her character too, subtly showing his intrusive thoughts worming their way in. And again, if you're familiar with what's really going on here, like these minor animation details speak volumes.
I'm gonna go look for Laura. I'll be back as soon as I can.
Especially again compared to the original where it often looked like James had overdosed on Botox.
How do you know about that?
You can also tell that Bloober Team took on some of the feedback they got from those earlier reveals, because the mood and tone in some of the cinematics, especially the way that James acts, has been redone entirely. Even the way that they redid that opening cinematic to make his introduction seem far more neutral, compared to that first reveal where the guy looked like he was in the middle of a nervous breakdown.
Thank you!
All of the dialogue still comes across as really awkward and uncomfortable, as if all of the characters haven't ever really interacted with another human before. But then again, like that's always been part of the charm. And at the end of the day, Laura still calls James a fart face, which, as we all know, is the most important line of dialogue that absolutely had to be preserved.
See a fart face.
But look, like the long and short of it is that this is still going to feel and sound completely different to the original. And that's kind of the dilemma you're going to face when you're trying to recreate something that had such a unique style to begin with. I mean, the cinematics and the dialogues in the original, they were awkward and stilted, sure, but a lot of that stuff was absolutely intentional. And the simple truth is that none of that was ever going to be perfectly recaptured in this remake.
I'm not lying.
So yeah, while it might not sound or look the same at all times, the overall themes, the metaphors, and that underlying premise is the same, which is really the most important thing.
I am here for you, James. See? I'm real.
What I also really appreciated about this remake was seeing all the old content, and then how they've carried that stuff across to rework it into all these new ideas. For instance, instead of running into Laura and Eddie at the Bowl-O-Rama, you're now seeing them at the local theatre, stuff like that.
Laura, stop! It's dangerous!
But then the game also still pays homage to its predecessor, with scenes and references to the original game lovingly recreated.
This town's full of monsters. Who could just sit here and eat pizza?
It's just like it's found a good balance here between adding in enough stuff to make the place seem new to returning players, but also keeping the feel of the original intact. Because outside of that, like the vast majority of the gameplay here is entirely new ground. I mean, it might be all the same locations with the hospital, the prison, and that kind of stuff, but the puzzles and items you need to find are completely unique to the remake. And then even if there's a puzzle that does return, the solution for it is going to be completely changed around. Like the coin puzzle from the apartments early on, for instance, has you having to now flip the coins to line up symbols on both sides, along with multiple phases which require new inputs. Still though, like, I never found like I was getting stuck for too long on any of the actual puzzles. And again, the map gives you some pretty helpful overlays as to where these areas of interest are, stuff which, by the way, can be toggled on or off. The puzzles are split up between the kind of thing where you'll outright want to start taking down notes with a pen and a pad, you know, the stuff that actually bakes your noodle, combined with the rest of the game that just feels like a bit of a scavenger hunt, where it's not really a puzzle in the traditional sense, more so you're just going around finding items that more often than not are going to have you instantly knowing where to put them. You know what I mean? Like you just found a pair of bolt cutters a few minutes after you came across a gate that's been locked up with a chain, like that kind of thing. And again in the apartment, for instance, like the bit where you need to throw that canned juice down the garbage chute, the juice itself is lying right there in the room, next to the chute. I mean, at that point, it's like my 2-year-old son could have figured it out. At least if nothing else, the inclusion of a hard mode for the puzzles is again going to work well in keeping people stumped. And again, like a lot of the solutions seem to be randomly generated. Without a doubt though, the thing they've overhauled the most here is the combat. And as anyone who's played that original game will likely tell you, the combat really wasn't one of its stronger points. I mean, look, like it was fine, it did what it had to do, but it was serviceable at the best of times. You aimed your gun at something, and then you shot at it until it died. Then you ran over and you stomped on it just to be sure. In the case of the melee weapons, you could outright just stun lock most enemies by spamming the attack button over and over. Well, the remake changes that shit entirely.
Oh, shit.
First off, you don't get to choose what melee weapon you've got equipped anymore. Early on in the game, as usual, you find the wooden plank, and then later after that, you get the metal pipe, with the pipe then outright replacing the plank from that point on. And at any time, if you press the attack button, you're going to swing whatever melee weapon you've got equipped. However, if you aim first with the left trigger or the right mouse button, James is going to pull out his equipped gun and you can shoot instead. It's all kind of similar to how it works in something like The Last of Us, where you're able to seamlessly flow from ranged attacks into melee, even in the same way that swinging your melee weapon kind of locks you into combat with one enemy at a time, with the camera then kind of zooming in to show off each hit. And yeah, like I said before, it is a whole lot better than having to go into your inventory and swap back and forth between all of these weapons. Ammo is also way more limited now as well compared to the original, where you could easily stockpile away like a couple of hundred handgun bullets and a few dozen shotgun shells. Now you're really only carrying around enough to get you through that next encounter. And as for the actual pickups, you'll be finding like 2 or 3 handgun bullets at a time. And this is a good thing, because it encourages you to be much more sensible and careful when using ammunition, along with the whole risk-reward thing of going for headshots over body shots, adding a much-needed layer of skill. The gun lineup again is pretty limited, again to only the pistol, the shotgun, and the rifle, with the pistol killing enemies in a few hits early on, but then almost requiring headshots to be effective later down the track, especially against the tougher monsters like the nurses. The shotgun, on the other hand, seems way more impactful here than it did in the original, with a single blast usually killing an enemy instantly. If not just knocking them on their ass so your boots or your pipe can finish off the job. And then the rifle is more or less like a one-shot kill against most standard enemies, and more or less against Silent Hill's version of the Magnum from Resident Evil. Best save for the boss fights or when you're really stuck up shit creek without a paddle. Overall, I think the shooting's definitely got that Resident Evil Remake feel to it, with the crosshair tightening the longer you manual aim, along with the way that enemies kind of sway back and forth to make them trickier targets. Combined, of course, with this whole new over-the-shoulder viewpoint, replacing that more dynamic camera from the original game, which in some ways does kind of play down that visual aspect of some of the environments. But again, like, give the modders a few months and I guarantee that someone's going to put that original camera style back in the game. Now, the other main mechanic that the combat introduces is the concept of dodging, something which I again mentioned in my Space Marine 2 video, which seems to be a must now for every third-person game that we get these days. And this is that very familiar move where James can dodge attacks from enemies by dashing out of the way. And this is where it does start to become a bit interesting because of the way that enemies are now designed, where they kind of have these unavoidable attacks. Unavoidable in the sense that if you're going toe-to-toe with someone, at some point they're going to fire off this highly telegraphed attack that can't really be interrupted and has to be dodged. Thankfully though, these attacks are pretty blatant and easy to see coming, and once you get the pattern down for enemies, it's pretty easy to avoid most incoming damage. The most annoying enemies in that regard though by far are the mannequins, because like in the original, when these things are idle, they're not emitting any static from the radio. And what this results in is lots of moments where these fucking assholes are just gonna pop out of nowhere and get a free shot in.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Because they were hiding in the corner of some room that you just entered. And unless you want to spend the entire game checking every single corner of every single room you enter, you're going to get bushwhacked by these things a fair bit. When attacking these things as well, you'll even see them hop out of the way to avoid James' melee attacks. And if you're trading blows with them, usually after every second or third hit, you're going to end up having to dodge one of theirs. As a result, like, it really makes the combat here feel reactionary, if that makes sense, compared to something like the RE4 Remake, for instance, where it's like you really felt like you had control over how things were panning out. I mean, in that game, you could like knock enemies on their asses with a shotgun if you needed a bit of breathing room. You could bait them near explosive barrels to thin out the herd, or just kind of shoot them in the knees to open them up for melee attacks. Silent Hill's combat, though, just kind of feels like you waiting for the enemies to play their hand, so you can then retaliate, before having to then go back on the defensive again and wait for an opening. And the nurses are the best example of this, having these multiple hit combos that you have to avoid, and even able to grab James's hand mid-attack and push him backwards. It also kind of reminds me a lot of Callisto Protocol in that sense, where you spend a sizable chunk of the combat loop just avoiding being hit in the first place. And it just kind of looks silly in a game like this, you know, considering you're playing as a guy who's supposed to just be a regular dude, but yet he can stick and move like he's Apollo Creed. And I feel like the whole thing's important to bring up because quite often you have no choice but to engage and fight these enemies. When you're out in the streets in those more wide open areas, at least you've got the option there to choose what kind of fights you want to get into. But for most of those interior sections, you're often not given any other choice, at which point it pretty much stops becoming survival horror and just becomes an action game with survival horror elements. I mean, like, honestly, like, it can't be overstated just how much combat there often is in this remake. And it feels like every single time you enter a new room, something's going to jump out of the shadows to attack you. So I really feel like this aspect is going to divide the play base a fair bit, considering how much of a focus there is on this and how much of the gameplay it actually takes up. If nothing else though, I do like that these enemies are an actual threat now. Considering that in the original, it was kinda laughable as to how easy it was to get through even large sections of the game without any real drama. Even taking on Pyramid Head for the first time was a really simple fight that you could beat without firing a single shot, by just running back and forth between the corners of the room. Here though, you pretty much have to keep the guy on your side at all times and watch out for that giant buster sword of his. It just kind of feels like that important decision making of trying to choose which enemies you want to engage with though has been done on your behalf, and more often than not you're forced into an encounter. And trying to run away is often just going to attract even more enemies. Which also highlights how the combat system isn't really designed around taking on multiples at once. Overall, I'd say that this is probably my main issue with the remake, because it really removes that element of avoiding enemies that you got in the original, which is something that's one of the cornerstones of good survival horror. And it's kind of like Bloober Team understood the assignment in that one of the biggest complaints about the original was the combat, and they thought that somehow the best way to improve it was to also just add in more of it. I mean, look, all up, I don't think it's a bad system, and it is a definite improvement. I guess I'm just kind of surprised at how much of it they actually included. The only other thing I want to point out is how some of the scenes just feel less impactful in the remake, and I'm going to warn you that this right here is major spoiler stuff. So look, if you don't want to hear about this, then skip to the time code on the screen.
In your dreams, fart face.
Right, so the first scene which really stuck out to me was the one with Pyramid Head, where James is hiding in the closet. Now in the original, this really felt like you'd walked into a nightmare, and as soon as James got into the room, this bizarre spectacle was already underway, where about all it could really do was hide in a nearby closet to try to keep a low profile. It was dark, dirty, and frightening, and it set Pyramid Head up as this horrific, surreal tormentor, who seemed to really be master of this whole domain. In the remake though, you enter this brightly lit room which otherwise looks completely normal, and then all of this stuff starts unfolding in front of James, who, despite all these upgrades and capabilities of facial animations in this new engine, barely acts like it even bothers him as to what's going on. Then he hides in the closet again as usual before firing a few shots off without even looking all that distressed. And it just feels like the surreal, unsettling nature of that original sequence is completely missing. As much as I do like this version of Maria as well, there are some instances where they just don't hit as hard as that original did either, which might have something to do with the voice acting, which just doesn't come across as panicked or frantic anymore.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? Anyway? What do you mean, anyway?
Like in that whole chase sequence when she's killed by Pyramid Head, it's like she completely goes limp and doesn't even react. And again, like compare that to how horrific this was in that original scene. At some point I might do like a more in-depth video covering more of these kind of issues, but you know what, for like a first time playthrough, outside of the abundance of combat, I really don't have that much to complain about with this remake.
So, what now?
I beat the whole thing in about 12 hours on the standard puzzle difficulty, and I have been seeing people say it took them upwards of 20 hours, yeah, which I guess is possible if you have everything cranked up to hard. But either way though, it is easily a longer playthrough than that original, and the fact that it's now got 8 endings is also going to extend that longevity out even more.
I'm sorry, it's not your problem.
The biggest problem this remake has though is that at the end of the day, it's still Silent Hill 2, which really at this point is just kinda boring to talk about. I mean, I'm not saying the game itself is boring, and as far as the story is concerned, it's got some humongous revelations that the new players are absolutely going to be shocked by. But the discussion around the story and the lore itself is just so played out by this point that there's really nothing interesting to say about it anymore. It's part of the reason why I've never really bothered doing a video on that original, is because it's like, what's there to say about something that's already been said and done a dozen times? The remake's best and worst feature is that it doesn't really add anything to that either. Respectfully, it doesn't mess around with those crucial plot points.
That's what I keep telling myself.
Despite it adding in all of this new stuff, all of these new mechanics and remixed environments, it still felt like I was playing something I'd already played 20 years ago. Maybe that's a good thing. I mean, overall, this remake's done a great job at being exactly what it needs to be. That is, a remake of a Silent Hill game made by people who aren't even really associated with Team Silent. Bloober Team have done a fantastic job here at updating a 23-year-old game the best they could, and making it accessible for a modern audience, who probably don't have the know-how or even the willingness to go back and experience that original. And I mean, that's fine, it's a great alternative for people looking for a more approachable way to experience one of gaming's greatest masterpieces.
Hello?
The question though is, did they really need to, and is it going to somehow replace the original? The answer to both is probably no. But you want to know what hurts the most about all of this is seeing how good a job they've done with this second game, while the vastly superior and ultimately more deserving of a remake first game got completely thrown to the wayside.
What's going on here?
Either way though, at least finally, all these so-called Silent Hill 2 fans on the internet can finally experience it for the first time.
I'll be waiting.